What if God was one of us? I was listening to Meet the Press as I was on my way to church this morning, and one of these politicians was criticizing the Democratic candidate for Senate in Texas, the Reverend James Tallarico, and was criticizing him because he said that God is non-binary. And there's so much wrong with that statement by this person, but let me just point out two things. Number one, I thought we don't have a religious test for office in the United States, and if that's what he believes, that's, yeah. And secondly, is God a man? Is God a woman? No. God is beyond gender, so non-binary comes as close as any description that's, I'm sorry, I just had to say that. Now let me get myself together here. I'm a little discombobulated. I kind of like this configuration. I think I'm going to rope off the last 5 rows. I don't feel so lonely and distant here. And thank the AV team for hanging in there when we had given up on them. They came through, and we appreciate that. And we're very, very thankful they're going to get some help, I understand. All right. So the lectionary has delivered us into some of the basic foundational stories of the faith. These stories are ones that every person should know. They are the introduction said, one of the most important passages in the Bible. No, I should correct myself. This story is one of the most important stories in Western civilization, because the story of Exodus, probably written in the 5th century before this common era, that's over 2,500 years ago, that story declared that slavery was wrong. That story declares that people ought to be free. That story actually says that God hears the cries of the oppressed and that God sends folks to relieve their oppression. That's the foundational text of what we call liberation theology, that asserts without apology God is on the side of the oppressed, not the oppressor. This is the story of the Hebrew Bible, of the Jewish faith. And as I've said in the past, and I'll repeat again, Christianity has committed the greatest act of cultural appropriation ever known. Just taken the whole literature and all of it and just made it their own. But indeed, these are the foundational stories of Western civilization. And we ought to pause and think that if 2,500 years ago we understood that a civilized people were against oppression and exploitation and for freedom, we need to check ourselves. Our passage today, I just want to highlight this verse. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built, a little textual error here, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians subjected the Israelites to hard servitude and made their lives bitter with hard servitude in mortar and bricks, and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks they imposed on them. It's from Exodus chapter 1. I'm calling our sermon today the Egyptian replacement theory. Now, I just couldn't resist. I'm sorry. The logic of this passage is the very logic that we hear too often today. But before we go to a day, just to comment about this passage. So the Egyptians had enslaved these Israelite people who had come into Egypt in a time of famine in their land of Canaan, and had come to Egypt because Egypt was a prosperous nation. And you got to read your stories. Spend some time in Genesis and Exodus, please, for your summer reading, because I can't tell you all the story. We'll be here till 2 o'clock. But as you should know, Joseph, sold into slavery by his brothers, was trafficked to Egypt. And there he rose from a slave to the prime minister of Egypt. And he was able to bring his family to Egypt, which had food in a time of famine, and they survived, and he was riding high until a change of administration. Oh, don't we know how a change of administration can impact our lives, amen? So there arose a Pharaoh, the old translation, a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph, and things changed rapidly. They enslaved these people, and as they enslaved them, they began to fear them as their numbers continued to grow. So in other words, this passage represents a story. And now, I'm not going to get into whether the Exodus really happened, whether this is history or not. It really doesn't matter. The story is the message, and the story carries the power. And if it were historical, it would be the most important slave rebellion in human history. And what we do know from our own history in the United States, that the slave-owning class had one continuing nightmare, and that was a slave rebellion. That's why they punished Nat Turner so viciously and cruelly, to send a message that they will put down any slave revolt with the utmost cruelty. That's why Napoleon sailed all the way from France to put down a slave revolt in the colony of Haiti. But he failed. And Haiti became, in fact, in modern history, the greatest slave revolt in modern history. And we have been punishing them ever since. That's another sermon. But this passage describes perfectly, and as I said, this literature is the literature of Western civilization. So those who are now propagating what they call the replacement theory or the great replacement theory, they read this story and they said, we've got biblical warrant for what we're doing. The replacement theory. Let me get my glasses here to read these slides. The Great Replacement Theory is a conspiracy theory, in the United States and certain other Western countries whose populations are mostly white, a far-right conspiracy theory alleging in one of its versions that left-leaning domestic or international elites, on their own initiative or under the direction of Jewish co-conspirators, are attempting to replace white citizens with non-white, that is, Black, Hispanic, Asian, or Arab immigrants. The replacement fantasy received much wider attention in the 21st century with the publication of The Grand Replacement in 2011 by the French writer and activist Renaud Camus. He argued that since the 70s, Muslim immigrants in France have shown disdain for French society and have been intent on destroying the country's cultural identity and ultimately replacing its white Christian population in retaliation for France's earlier colonization of their countries of origin. So, what they see as a calculated scheme, that's why I call it this conspiracy fantasy, that somewhere in the world there is this Jewish group of folk who are sending immigrants from Algeria, sending immigrants from Libya, sending immigrants from Morocco and from Nigeria into France in order to replace the population there. No such thing is happening, folks. But how is it that they find a way to put all their enemies in one basket and shake it up? No such thing is happening as a conspiracy. What is happening is that the process of immigration that is happening all over the world, in Europe and here in the United States, immigration is like osmosis. When you have a higher concentration of wealth on one side of the membrane, then those on the other side migrate to that higher concentration. This process of immigration is the natural result of colonization. It's not a conspiracy. It's the natural result of colonization. Now, human migration, if we listen to this story and how they got there in the first place and where they went afterwards, human migration is the way of human history and the way of human progress. Did we not just celebrate 250 years of the Declaration of Independence that was declared by a group of immigrants from England? It is the way of human history and the way of human progress. We cannot, here in this country, take over half of Mexico in the US-Mexican War and then complain about the presence of Mexicans in our country. As they say, they didn't cross the border crossed them. All over the world, the effects of colonialism are coming back, some would say, to bite the Europeans. You saw our son Marcus and his family last week. We had opportunity to visit them 2 years ago, and we're going to be going to visit them next month, and so I'll be on vacation to visit them. But while we're there in Amsterdam, we usually take a few days for a side trip. And last year, we went to Brussels. I've never been to Brussels, just thought it'd be a nice little, it was not that far away, see a different part of Europe. But I was personally astonished, because I was just ignorant, at how many Africans are in Brussels. And then you look at the history. When you look at the history, Belgium, colonized, brutalized, oppressed, exploited, tortured the Congo for decades. King Leopold of Belgium declared the whole of the Congo as his personal property. Yeah, I didn't know about this king stuff because I grew up here in America, but that's what monarchs do. In fact, what we learned as we studied the 250th anniversary of our Declaration of Independence, that King George, the colonies of the United States were King George's own property. So that's why he was so vested in holding on to them. And when you talk about the modern monarchy, many of those things continue. When they stripped Harry of his royal titles, they also stripped him of his royal possessions that provide the resources for the monarchy. King Leopold was the most brutal colonizer in history. If the people who were working in the fields and in the plants did not produce enough, he gave instruction to the overseers to amputate their hands as punishment and as a inevitable. That's the part that's true. When you watch the impact, there will be more immigration. It is just the way of the world. But the real question is, who are we as a people? Who are we as a society? Do we favor slavery or do we favor freedom? Do we favor oppression or do we favor liberation? This story, 2,500 years ago, tells us that the God we serve favors liberation. The God we serve favors freedom. So what is the answer or the alternative to this replacement theory? The only answer to the replacement theory is the one humanity theory. The true belief that not only is beauty only skin deep, but so is so-called race. That the only difference between any of us in this room or on this planet is how much melanin you have in your skin. And that melanin, the melanin on my forehead, does not seep into my brain. And so if the melanin is the only thing that's different from you and me, if our race theories are only skin deep, then there is nothing different between us. Race is a political construct and an economic device to exclude a population from the goods, resources, and opportunity of a society and to hoard them for another segment of that same society. And it happens in every community. Ours just happens to be organized around melanin. So if that is true, we could organize ourselves according to eye color. So where's all my brown-eyed siblings? All my brown-eyed siblings, stand up. So you and I have more in common with our brown eyes than anybody else. We could organize society that way. Where are my blue eyes? Where are my blue eyes? Stand up. I'm sitting down. It's just another way of organizing our society. It makes no difference. Now, are the blue-eyed people smarter than the brown-eyed people because the blue seeps into their brain? No. No. So the antidote to the racism of the replacement theory is the one humanity theory that posits that we are all children of the same God, that we are all brothers and sisters and siblings. I ask you this, as some of you know my origin story of being here at Pilgrim. I was pastoring a church in Los Angeles, the Congregational Church of Christian Fellowship, which was one of the few African-American congregations in the UCC. And the UCC is only about 4 or 5% black. So when I left there and I was coming into the search and call process, I said, there aren't many churches for me to apply to if I'm only going to pastor black churches. So I guess I'll have to apply to a white church. And yeah, I encountered the kind of racism that I kind of expected. Now, the churches that would not even interview me, that's all I asked. You didn't have to call me, but at least meet me. They wouldn't see it that way, but I understand how this thing works. But Pilgrim, I understand they had discussed the possibility even before I was in the candidate pool, that yes, we're open to calling a black pastor. And so I applied, and you called me. But why did I come? I call myself sometimes a missionary to white people. But has the sole goal of my being here for 22 years been to prove to you that black people are human? No. The sole goal of my being here for 22 years is to give you a chance to be human. We need a multicultural, multiracial congregation because any other kind of community is a lie. It's a lie to say that this is humanity. It's a lie to say that we are the world, unless we are open and have present people from all over the world. I remember when I first sat here on the steps when I used to do the children's sharing time every Sunday, and I enjoyed it. I try to get into the rotation now every now and then. But I remember sitting here, and I said to some of my friends, they were asking me, what's that experience like being down there at Carlsbad? Well, I told a lot of my friends, well, I'm going to Carlsbad. They said, Carlsbad? Are you sure? Are you sure you mean Carlsbad? Are you lost? I said, no, Carlsbad. But I would tell them, I said, I come down here and I have like 10 shiny blonde kids sitting all around me. I feel like I need sunglasses when I'm doing the children's sharing time. But I sat on the steps and they sat next to me. And it dawned on me that was probably the closest they'd ever been to a black man. Some of your children had never sat on the knee or next to in that proximity. And so even that gesture, as unintended as it was, I hope and pray had some impact in normalizing their humanity. That's why I love our communion. When we come to the table and stand around it in our kind of randomness of how we gather, all those predetermined seating arrangements get broken up. Sometimes even couples get broken up, and you're standing next to someone, you're looking across that table at someone who looks different than you, And what I hope and pray is that all we see is a sibling with a little more melanin. And so for all you melanin-challenged folks, God bless you. God bless you with some more melanin. But on the serious side, that's what this project is. That's what this church is. That's what this community, that's what this whole project is. To love one another as human beings and to receive and accept and to look at one another as just a human being. And that's the way we break the fever fantasy of the replacement theory. In Egypt and in America, let the people of God say,